and I will be doing the use of primary sources in John Dower's War Without Mercy. In War Without Mercy, John Dower reinforces his argument and his overall theme of the book through the utilization of these primary sources. These primary sources include songs, slogans, cartoons, propaganda films, secret reports, private conversations, and other kinds of primary sources, such as autobiographies and court cases. I'd like to note that the seventh tool or the seven types of primary sources were used sparingly, whereas the first six were used throughout the novel. I would also like to say that my friend Rico will be focusing his part of the presentation on songs, slogans, propaganda films, and other kinds of primary sources, whereas I will be focusing it on cartoons, secret reports, and private conversations. In the first kinds of primary source, which is private conversation, this is the most common use of primary source throughout the book, and it effectively, not only effectively, but it does a superb job in reinforcing the theme or basic components of the theme, which is the systematic racism and scientific racism that America's had for so long. And it should be no surprise that they were not gonna treat the Japanese any different than minorities within their realm or their colonies. Many of these accounts have a single theme, which is the constant attack on the Japanese based on scientific racism and hatred due to their skin complexions. I'd also like to note that it was not just the soldiers that they made these attacks to, but to ordinary citizens and Japanese culture. In the first quote, according to the first postulate that the Japanese as a race have defects of the tubes of the inner ear, just as they are generally myopic. This gives them a defective sense of balance, the one physical sense in which an aviator is not permitted to be deficient. And in the second quote, although these barbarians are not altogether mad, they are not far from being so. They are not or are longer capable of governing themselves any more than the madmen or even wild beasts and animals. Their stupidity is much greater than of children and madmen in their countries. Both of these quotes provide an understanding of how just racist the United States was during World War II against the Japanese. The first quote has no medical or even ethical understanding or basis to provide this such scientific racist notions. And in the second quote, they essentially were calling the Japanese primitive or savages, and they could no longer govern themselves without any factual reasoning. I'd also like to say that the use of private conversation in Dower's book was not just by ordinary soldiers and officers in the Second World War, but Dower notes private conversations and insights from leaders such as Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, who were at the time the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Great Britain. In this quote, Roosevelt claimed that the Japanese soldier had been built officially and unofficially as a sort of Superman, superdevil in ability, ferocity, and training. Dower also notes that there were secret informal conversations by Winston Churchill that he was advocating for the extermination of the Japanese race. In secret reports, which is one of the many uses of primary sources, many of these military intelligences that came in the form of reports reinforced this idea that America was engaging in scientific racism and overall systematic racism against the Japanese in World War II. These were considered to be true, ethical, and justified at the time. Not also America, but also Western allies engaged in this scientific racism. In the first quote, Canadian officers attending a briefing, a British officer in Hong Kong were informed that Japanese aircrafts were mostly obsolete, and its air force had little practice in night flying, and its pilots were myopic, and these carry out dive bombing attacks. In the second quote, the Japanese were said to be untrained in guerrilla warfare and a jungle combat, and indeed culturally and temperamentally unsuited for these. Again, these reinforce the idea that the United States and its Western allies were pretty racist. And I'd like to note that Japanese equipment in World War II was actually pretty good, and that they were performing successful missions in their aircrafts. In the second quote, there was no ethical or moral basis to explain such scientific racism. Cartoons were also depicted throughout the book, and John Dower uses both sides in the sense that he wants to differentiate how much the United States did and how much the Japanese did in their political cartoons. The Japanese focused on their political cartoons on American soldiers and the government rather than ordinary citizens, whereas Americans focused their political cartoons on the Japanese citizens as well. And this backed up the idea of scientific racism. In the first picture on the left hand side, you'll see that the it was a political cartoon made by the Japanese, calling the Statue of Liberty a false beacon of democracy. They in fact called the Japanese they in fact called the Statue of Liberty a beacon of dictatorship, as the United States is an oppressive state to its minorities and colonies. The picture to the right depicts either Winston Churchill or FDR, calling them demonic for their hypocrisy and brutal imperialistic ways. Overall, Dower did a superb job in utilizing several uses of primary sources in order to convey his message. His overall message, in which one of my partners, Alexis, talked about, was that America was never the saint as it claims when learning about the narrative of World War II. In my personal opinion, this book is a must for those who want to understand the deeper complexities of World War II. It eliminates the notion of good versus bad, offers a more critical understanding of America, and a student of history should really read its perspective. The United States itself was not a saint as it claims, as they were engaging in scientific racism and systematic oppression. Dower uses several instances of primary sources in order to convey this. I will let Rico talk about the rest of the use of primary sources. Thank you very much.